She said 4 words to me that first night that I still think about. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It was past 11. I was sitting on the floor of my new kitchen in Savannah, back against the cabinet, eating cold leftover rice straight from the container because I had exactly 1 working burner on the stove and I had already used it twice that day trying to boil water for instant coffee. The house on Kellerman Street had looked like a good decision in the photos. In person, it looked like a project that had been abandoned by someone with very high hopes and very low follow-through. Boxes stacked in every corner. A window in the back bedroom that let in more wind than light. A bathroom faucet that dripped not in a steady rhythm you could ignore, but in that specific irregular pattern that seemed almost personal, like it was doing it on purpose just to make sure you couldn't sleep. 3 weeks earlier, I had packed up my life in Atlanta and driven south with 2 suitcases and a quiet promise to myself. The promise was simple. Build something real this time. Not just the work, not just the career, but the actual life around it. I had left a large architecture firm where I was doing good work for other people's visions and decided, at 36, that it was time to start my own practice. Savannah made sense for a dozen professional reasons. But if I was being honest with myself, which I was trying to get better at, I had also needed to go somewhere that didn't already know my name. So there I was. New city. Half-broken house. Cold rice at 11 at night. I was not in the mood for company. The knock came anyway. I almost ignored it. I told myself it was probably a neighbor introducing themselves at the worst possible time, or someone who had the wrong address. I sat there for a full 10 seconds deciding not to move. Then it came again. Same pace, same pressure. Patient and unhurried, the kind of knock that does not get louder to demand your attention but somehow gets your attention anyway, simply by continuing to exist. I got up. The woman standing under my porch light was not what I expected. Not that I had expected anything in particular, but still. She was in scrubs, dark blue, slightly wrinkled in the way that suggested they had been worn for a very long stretch of hours, with an oversized gray jacket pulled over them like an afterthought against the evening air. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a loose knot, a few strands fallen free around her face, and she was holding a small flashlight in one hand, not pointing it at anything, just holding it, the way people hold objects when they are using them as a reason to be somewhere. She looked at me and stopped. "I think I left this here last week," she said, holding out the flashlight. Then she tilted her head slightly and her eyes moved to my face with the careful focus of someone recalibrating fast. "Wait, you're not Mr. Hadley." "No," I said. "I'm Noah. I moved in about 3 weeks ago." Something moved across her face. Not embarrassment exactly. More like a quiet internal adjustment, the kind a person makes when new information arrives and they process it without making a scene about it. She had clearly knocked on this door before without any of this being a surprise. Now it was a surprise, and she was handling it with a kind of calm efficiency that I noticed even then. "Nora," she said, "I live next door. I'm sorry about the knock." I genuinely had no idea anyone new had moved in. "Mr. Hadley sold." "Sold to me," I said. She nodded once. Then, instead of leaving, she looked past me into the house. Not in a rude way, not like she was trying to inspect anything. More the way a person does when a space they thought they understood turns out to be different from what they remembered, and their eyes move toward it before they make the conscious decision to look. I had 2 open boxes in the hallway behind me. A folding table that was serving as my temporary desk. A floor lamp I had plugged in but not yet positioned properly, so it was throwing light at a strange angle across the ceiling. The whole place had the specific look of a house that was being worked on by someone who was also tired. "You've got a lot of work ahead of you," she said. It was a simple observation. No judgment in it, just a fact stated plainly by someone who could see what she was looking at. But something about the directness of it, the way she said it without softening it into a question or wrapping it in a compliment, made me feel less like a stranger and more like a person who had simply been seen. "Tell me something I don't know," I replied. She almost smiled. Not quite. Just the beginning of one, the kind that starts and then gets reconsidered, like she had caught herself before she fully committed to it. Then she held out the flashlight again. "For what it's worth," she said, "this might actually be yours now. I found it in the back of the side yard. It was probably Hadley's, But since you're the one who owns the yard. I took it from her. She just held it out and I took it and that was that. Thanks, I said. Welcome to Kellerman Street, she said. And then she turned and walked back toward the house next door, her shoes quiet on the path, the porch light next door clicking on automatically as she reached her front steps. I stood in my doorway for a moment after she went inside. The street was quiet. Cicadas somewhere in the trees. A dog barking faintly 2 or 3 houses down. The warm Savannah night sitting heavy and still around everything. I looked down at the flashlight in my hand. And I thought, without meaning to, without any particular reason, I wonder what kind of doctor she is. I went back inside. I finished the cold rice. The faucet dripped its irregular rhythm in the back of the house. But something about the evening felt slightly less empty than it had an hour before. I didn't see her for 3 days after that. I know because I noticed. Not in a way I was proud of, not in some dramatic sense. Just in the quiet background way you notice the absence of something that briefly made an impression. Her car left early each morning. I knew this because I was usually already up, usually already standing at the kitchen window with instant coffee, going over my project notes before the heat of the day settled in. The car was a dark gray sedan, practical, clean but not new. It backed out of her driveway before 6 every single morning, taillights disappearing around the corner while Kellerman Street was still mostly asleep. I told myself I was simply observant. I was an architect. Noticing detail was part of the job. On the 4th day, Walter introduced himself. He came from 2 houses down on a Saturday morning while I was repainting the porch railing, which had originally been white, but had at some point been painted over in a shade of beige that I found personally offensive. He was somewhere in his 70s, unhurried in the way of someone who had made peace with his own pace a long time ago, and he carried a small container of homemade lemon bars that he held out to me with the straightforward confidence of a man who knew they were good and saw no reason to be modest about it. His name was Walter Briggs, retired high school principal, 31 years on Kellerman Street. You'll figure the neighborhood out fast enough, he said, leaning against the porch post like he had been standing in this exact spot his whole life. Small street, good people mostly, quiet on weeknights. The Delgados at the end have a dog that thinks it owns the sidewalk, but you get used to it. I asked about the previous owner, Hadley, mostly to make conversation. Walter gave me the condensed version. Widower. Lived alone the last several years. Decided the house was too much work and moved to be closer to his daughter up in Virginia. Good man, Walter said. Bad at gutters. I laughed. It was the first time I had genuinely laughed since moving in. Then, because I was apparently less subtle than I thought, I asked about the neighbor next door. Walter looked at me the way someone does when they were already expecting the question. Nora Calloway, he said. Gynecologist over at Memorial Health. Been on this street about 4 years now. He paused, picking the right words with the care of someone who respected accuracy. Good neighbor. Keeps to herself mostly. Works too much. Comes from an old Savannah family. Her father's Robert Calloway. He said the name with the quiet emphasis of someone who expected it to land. Then, when it didn't, added, very connected. Very established. The kind of family that's been here long enough that their name is on a building somewhere downtown. I filed that away without saying much about it and went back to the railing. Walter stayed another 20 minutes talking about the neighborhood, the history of Kellerman Street, and the single best place in Savannah to get a proper shrimp and grits. By the time he left, I had a full picture of a street that had its own quiet rhythms and its own particular kind of community. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I was thinking about a woman who came home after dark and left before sunrise. I had witnessed something on Thursday evening, 2 days before Walter's visit. Nora had been standing at the edge of her driveway, still in her white coat, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in the measured, precise tone of someone who had decided long ago that patience was the most powerful tool she had. I couldn't hear the words. I wasn't trying to, but I could see the way she held her shoulders, straight, steady, entirely in control, and the way her free hand stayed still at her side when most people would have been gesturing or pacing. Whoever was on the other end of that call eventually stopped talking. I saw her lower the phone, look at it for a moment, and then slip it into her coat pocket with the practiced efficiency of someone moving on to the next thing. She had gone inside without looking over. Now it was Tuesday evening. I was on the porch with a second attempt at decent coffee and a set of plans for a historic district renovation project that was giving me problems I hadn't anticipated. The clients wanted to open up a wall that had more structural responsibility than they realized, and I was trying to figure out how to explain that to them without making it sound like their vision was impossible. I heard the car before I saw it. The dark gray sedan pulled into the driveway next door at 8:17. She got out slowly, not with the brisk efficiency of someone transitioning from one task to the next, but with the careful deliberateness of a person managing limited reserves. She stood at the open car door for a moment, one hand still on the roof, like she was deciding something. Then she closed the door, walked to her porch steps, and sat down on them. She did not go inside. She just sat there, bag beside her, jacket still on, staring at the magnolia tree in her front yard with the expression of a person who had nothing left to give to the evening and was simply waiting for the day to officially end. I watched her for maybe 30 seconds, long enough to recognize something in that particular stillness that I understood from the inside. "Rough day," I called over, not loudly, just enough. She turned her head toward me like she had genuinely forgotten the street existed. Her eyes found me on the porch, and she seemed to take a second to place me. Then she let out a breath that seemed to travel up from somewhere deep. "I had a delivery today," she said. "That didn't go the way it was supposed to." A pause. "Everyone's okay." Another pause, smaller. But there were about 20 minutes in that room where I wasn't sure. I nodded. I didn't say I'm sorry or that must have been hard or any of the things people say when they want to fill space. I just nodded and let the words sit where she had placed them. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Rough day." I went back to my blueprints. I gave her the silence. Some people need someone to talk at them when they're struggling. Other people need someone to simply be nearby without making it a production. She struck me as the second kind. About 10 minutes passed. The street settled further into the evening. Somewhere down the block, a sprinkler came on and ran for a few minutes before cutting off. "What are you working on?" she asked. I looked up. She had shifted slightly, turned just enough that she was facing my direction rather than the magnolia. "Renovation project in the historic district," I said. "Client wants to take out a wall that is, structurally speaking, doing a lot of heavy lifting." She tilted her head slightly. "Can you do it?" "With the right support system, yes," I said. "The tricky part is making people understand that taking something apart carefully is not the same as leaving it broken." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know exactly what you mean." And just like that, without either of us deciding it, the conversation opened up. She told me more about the delivery. Not the medical specifics, but the feeling of it. She described the way time moves differently in a room when something starts going wrong. How the air gets heavier and everyone shifts their eyes to you, not because they're lost, but because they need to see that you're not. She talked about the particular weight of being the steadiest person in a frightened room, and what it costs, and where that cost goes at the end of a day when you finally let yourself stop being steady. I told her about Atlanta, about the firm I had left, the years of doing excellent work inside someone else's blueprint for what success should look like, and the specific moment I understood that comfortable and right were not always the same thing. I told her about the fear that came with starting something from scratch at an age when most people expected you to already have things figured out. She listened without interrupting, without looking at her phone, without offering solutions or comparisons or silver linings. She just listened, and the quality of her attention was something I felt in the way you feel a room temperature change. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. We talked for nearly 2 hours. When she finally stood to go inside, she picked up her bag and paused at her door. She looked over at me one more time, and in the porch light her expression was quieter than when she had arrived. Less like someone managing a weight and more like someone who had set it down for a little while. "Noah," she said. "Yeah. The railing on the left side of your porch steps." She nodded toward it. "It's about to come off. You should fix that before someone grabs it for balance and ends up on the ground." I looked over at the railing. She was right. It was barely attached, the lower bracket pulling away from the wood in a way that was obvious once you knew to look for it. "Thanks," I said. She nodded once and went inside. I stayed on the porch for a while after her door closed. The cicadas were loud in the trees. A warm breeze moved through the street. I looked at the broken railing. Then I thought about the way she had said my name. Not like she was testing it out. Not like an afterthought. She said it the way you say the name of something you have already made a small, quiet decision to remember. I picked up my blueprints and went inside. I fixed the railing the next morning. First thing, she came over to borrow a wrench. That is how it started. Nothing romantic. Nothing planned. Just a woman in scrubs standing at my door holding a pipe fitting she had no idea what to do with, and me trying very hard to act like that was a completely normal Tuesday afternoon. I followed her next door. She had been trying to fix a slow leak under her kitchen sink for what looked like at least 3 attempts. Judging by the towels on the floor and the cabinet door hanging open at an angle that suggested some frustration had been involved. I got down on the floor, fit the wrench, tightened the fitting, and had the whole thing done in under 5 minutes. She stared at me. "That's it. That's it," I said. She looked at the cabinet, then at me, then at the towels on the floor. "I spent 40 minutes on that. Do you want me to leave so you can be alone with that information?" I asked. She looked at me for a half-second like she was deciding something. Then she laughed. Not politely. A real laugh, the kind that happens before a person can stop it. It was the first time I had heard her laugh like that, and I made a note of it somewhere I did not examine too closely. She told me to stay. She was cooking, she said, and I had earned at least a plate for saving her from a flooded kitchen. I sat at her kitchen table while she moved around the stove with the focused ease of someone who cooked the way she worked, without wasted motion, without second-guessing. The kitchen smelled like garlic and something herby I could not name, and the late afternoon light came in through the window above the sink in a way that made everything feel slower and quieter than the rest of the week had been. We ate at that table and talked about Savannah. She had opinions about this city. Real ones, not the kind people repeat from travel articles. She told me which streets flooded after heavy rain and which neighborhoods were quietly becoming something new. She knew which old buildings had been sold off to developers and which ones had been saved by people who actually cared. She talked about the city the way you talk about a place you chose on purpose, not one you ended up in by accident. I told her I had been in Savannah long enough to have questions but not yet long enough to have answers. "That's the best place to be," she said. "You still notice things." "What do you notice anymore?" I asked. She thought about it. "When my patients are scared before they say anything. When a building is older than it looks. When someone is listening versus just waiting to talk." She paused. "You listen?" she added, almost like a footnote, like she hadn't entirely meant to say it out loud. I did not respond right away. I just picked up my fork and kept eating, and let the observation sit there between us without making it into something bigger than she was ready for. After dinner she made coffee, real coffee, not the kind from a pod, and I told her about a rooftop I had found 2 weeks earlier while scouting a renovation project near the river. I had been up there alone at golden hour and stood at the railing and thought that this city had arranged itself specifically for that exact view. The water, the rooftops, the light going copper and wide across everything. She set down her mug. "You should show me sometime," she said, casual, like it did not mean anything. But she looked away the moment the words came out, like they had moved a little faster than she intended. She reached for the coffee pot and refilled her cup and steered the conversation to something easier before I could respond. I let her do it. I understood the instinct completely because I was doing the exact same thing. Because here is what I had not said out loud yet. I was rearranging my evenings around the possibility of running into her. Not in a dramatic way. Small things. Staying on the porch a little longer. Timing a walk for when I knew she might be getting home. Noticing the sound of her car pulling in the way you notice weather. Not thinking about it exactly, just registering it somewhere below conscious thought. I was fixing things around my house at a rate that had nothing to do with how fast they actually needed fixing. She had good eyes. She noticed progress, and I wanted her to see it. I did not say any of that. I finished my coffee, thanked her for dinner, and walked back across our shared driveway under a sky that had gone from purple to almost black. At my door, I turned around. She was still standing in her doorway, leaning one shoulder against the frame with her arms loosely crossed, watching me walk home the way people sometimes do when they are not ready for something to end but will not say so. "Same time next week?" I asked. She smiled, slow and quiet. "Only if something else breaks." I went inside. I stood in my kitchen for a moment, looking at the one working burner on my stove, and thought about the way she had leaned against that doorframe. About the laugh I had not expected. About the way she said I listen like it was something rare. I was not falling the way people fall in stories, fast and obvious and announced. It was something slower than that. Something that had been building in the background like a room being renovated quietly, one wall at a time, while I was busy paying attention to everything else. And I was fairly certain I was not the only one. Then, 3 days later, something happened that I had not prepared for. I was walking back from picking up supplies 2 streets over, still thinking about blueprints, still half inside a problem with a load-bearing wall on the Historic District project, when I turned onto Kellerman Street and stopped. There was a dark SUV parked in Nora's driveway. Not her car. Not Walter's old sedan from across the way. A large, clean, expensive-looking vehicle that had been parked with the kind of ease that comes from knowing your car belongs wherever you put it. A man was standing at her front door. Tall, pressed shirt. The kind of posture that does not come from trying. It just lives in a person who has spent their whole life being told they matter. He had one hand loosely in his pocket, and he was looking at the door like he expected it to open before he knocked a second time. It did. Nora opened it. She did not look surprised to see him. She did not look particularly unhappy either. But she did not step back immediately to let him in. She stood in the doorway for a moment and they spoke. Too far away for me to hear anything, but close enough that I could see her shift her weight slightly, a small careful adjustment, the kind that happens when a person is deciding how much space to give. I kept walking. I did not slow down. I turned into my driveway, went through my front door, and set my supplies down on the kitchen counter. Then I stood there in the quiet of my unfinished kitchen and told myself it was nothing. A colleague, family friend, someone who came to return something, the same way Nora had once stood on my porch with a flashlight. I almost believed it, but that night, for the first time since I had moved to Kellerman Street, I left my porch light off, and I lay awake longer than I should have, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the way she had stood in that doorway, not surprised, not unhappy, and wondering exactly what kind of nothing it was. I found out his name before I was ready for it. Walter was in his front yard the next morning, moving through his garden beds with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who treated Saturday mornings like a sacred appointment. I crossed the street to return a level he had lent me 2 weeks earlier, and before I had even held it out, he gave me a look, the kind that means information is already loaded and waiting. "Saw Griffin Hale's car over at Nora's last night," he said. Not gossip, more like a man reading the weather aloud. I told him I did not know who that was. Walter set the level against his porch railing. "Cardiologist. Works out of St. Joseph's. Robert Calloway has been trying to get those two in the same room for about 2 years now." He paused. "Good family. The Hales and the Calloways go a long way back." I nodded. I said something neutral. I walked back to my house. I spread every set of blueprints I owned across the dining room table. I lined them all up and I sat down and I committed fully to being a person who cared about nothing except load-bearing walls and window placements and whether the roofline on a Victorian renovation was historically accurate. That lasted about 40 minutes. Then came a knock at the door. I opened it and Nora was standing on my porch in running clothes. Dark leggings, a gray long-sleeve shirt, her dark hair loose around her face from a run she had clearly already finished. Her cheeks were flushed. She was holding 2 coffees. The kind from the place on Forsyth Park. The one she had told me early on was the only coffee worth the detour in the whole neighborhood. She was holding one out toward me before I had even fully stepped back from the door. "I ran past your street twice," she said. "Talked myself out of stopping both times. A beat. Then I decided that was a stupid thing to do. I stepped back and let her in. She sat at my dining table and wrapped both hands around her cup, the way people do when they want something solid to hold. She looked at the blueprints spread across the table. Not politely, not just acknowledging them. She actually looked. Her eyes moved over the pages with the same focused attention she had given to her kitchen leak, like she was solving something rather than admiring it. "Is this the historic district project?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "The clients want to take the entire back wall to glass. Open the whole thing up." She studied the layout quietly for a moment. "That's going to pull in a lot of afternoon heat on that side of the street." I looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I live in Savannah," she said simply. "Which direction does the back wall face?" "Southwest." She nodded like that confirmed exactly what she already suspected. "You'll need something to offset it. A deep overhang, or the right glass coating, or both." "That's exactly what I told them," I said. "They haven't decided yet. They'll decide when their first summer electric bill arrives," she said, and picked up her coffee. I watched her look at the plans for another moment. She was not performing interest. She was actually interested, and there is a difference you can feel in a room. "You think about how people are actually going to live in the space," she said. "Not just how it photographs." "How do you know I do that?" I asked. She glanced up at me. "Because of the porch layout sketch you showed me last week. You put the chair placement in before any furniture was chosen. You were already imagining someone sitting there." She said it the way you state something obvious. Like she had noticed it and filed it away without deciding to, the way you remember a song you did not know you were listening to. She had been watching more carefully than I realized. The thought settled in my chest somewhere I did not immediately analyze. We stayed at that table for a long time. The coffee went from hot to warm to cool while we talked about the project, about design, about the way a building can either work with the people inside it or push back against them. She asked questions that were sharper than I expected. I answered them honestly. At some point I stopped thinking about Griffin Hale's car in her driveway and just existed in the conversation. Then she said something that surprised me. "I think I chose medicine for the same reason you chose architecture," she said. She was looking at the blueprints, not at me. "Because buildings and bodies are both systems. And if you understand the system, you can figure out what it needs before something goes wrong." I had never heard it described that way. I told her so. She looked up. "You never thought about it like that?" "I thought about the buildings," I said. "I didn't think about the parallel." She smiled, small, private, like she was pleased to have offered something useful. And I thought again, without planning to, about how she had said I listened like it was rare. About how she had looked away after saying I should show you sometime. About all the small careful ways she kept offering something and then pulling back a half step, like she was not yet sure the ground would hold. I understood it. I was doing the same thing. The afternoon had gone golden by the time she stood to leave. She gathered her coffee cup and paused at the edge of the table, looking at the blueprints one more time. "You're going to convince them on the overhang," she said. "How do you know?" "Because you're right," she said. "And you know how to explain things so they land." She left. I stood at the window and watched her cross back to her house, and I thought about everything she had noticed about me without me noticing her noticing. Then I sat back down at the table and stared at the blueprints for a while without seeing them. That evening she texted me. Just one line. No context. "The coffee on Forsyth is better when you don't drink it alone." I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the table and sat with the particular feeling of someone who has just received more than they were prepared to hold, and is trying very hard not to drop it. I did not respond right away, but I did not stop smiling for the rest of the night. Then that Friday arrived, and everything I had been carefully not overthinking walked right up and knocked on the door of reality. I was on my way back from buying supplies 2 streets over when I turned onto Kellerman and saw the same dark SUV parked in Nora's driveway again.
Griffin Hale.
Same car. Same unhurried confidence in the way it sat at the curb. This time Nora was standing just inside her open doorway, and even from a distance I could see that her posture was different from the easy way she stood at my door. There was a careful quality to it, a kind of stillness that looks like calm but is actually management. I went inside. I made myself busy. I did not check the window. But later that night, sitting on my darkened porch, lights still off, same as the last time, I heard her front door close. Then the SUV started. Then the street went quiet. And a few minutes after that, my phone buzzed. A text from Nora. For words. Are you still up? I stared at the screen. Outside, Kellerman Street had gone fully dark. A warm wind moved through the trees. I typed back. Yeah. Porch. 30 seconds later, her front door opened. She crossed the driveway and sat down on my porch steps. She didn't say anything at first. Neither did I. We just sat there in the dark while the street settled around us. Two people close enough to hear each other breathe. Then she told me about Griffin. Not as a confession, not as an apology, just plainly the way she stated most things. Her father had introduced them 2 years ago. They had seen each other occasionally, never seriously, but the introductions kept happening and the dinners kept being arranged and she had kept showing up because it was easier than having the larger conversation. And tonight? I asked. Tonight I told him I wasn't interested in pursuing anything further. She said. He took it well. He probably already knew. I looked out at the street. The porch light next door was off. Mine was off. Just the two of us in the dark. Why tonight? I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. Because I kept thinking about someone else, she said. And that didn't seem fair to him. She didn't look at me when she said it. She kept her eyes on the magnolia tree across the way. But I felt it land, and I let it, and I didn't try to be careful about it. I reached over and took her hand. She let me. We sat like that until the air cooled and the street went fully quiet, and that was enough for now. That was more than enough. What followed was the kind of beginning that doesn't announce itself. There was no dramatic declaration. No moment where we both looked at each other and named what was happening. It was smaller than that and better because of it. She started coming over without a reason. I started cooking for two without being asked. The porch light stayed on every night on both sides of the driveway, and nobody said anything about it because neither of us needed to. We went to the rooftop near the river on a Sunday evening, the one I had told her about weeks earlier. She stood at the railing and looked out at the water and the copper light going wide across the rooftops of the city, and she was quiet for a long time. You were right, she said finally. About what? That the city arranged itself for this exact view. I stood beside her at the railing and thought. Yes, and I thought other things too, about the particular feeling of standing next to someone and not needing to fill the silence, about how long it had taken me to find that on Kellerman Street without knowing I was looking for it. We walked the riverfront on Sunday mornings before the tourists arrived. She cooked on nights she got home before 8. I handled every broken and malfunctioning thing in both houses, which kept me busy enough. We stayed up past midnight talking about everything and nothing with the particular ease of people who have stopped being careful around each other. And slowly, without either of us making a speech about it, we stopped being two people building separate lives next door to each other. We became something with a shape, even if we hadn't yet given it a name. But there were complications outside our quiet stretch of Kellerman Street. The largest one had a name and a parking spot, Robert Calloway. Nora told him she was not going to pursue anything with Griffin about 2 weeks after the night on my porch. She had done it over the phone, directly, in the calm and measured tone I had come to recognize as her way of handling the things that cost her most. Her father had not shouted. He had gone still and formal, the kind of quiet, she told me, that felt like being reclassified. He said he hoped I knew what I was doing, she said, sitting on my porch steps that evening with a cup of tea going cold in her hands. Do you? I asked. Yes, she said. I really think I do. And sure enough, 2 mornings later, I opened my front door and found Robert Calloway standing on my porch. No call. No warning. Just a man in a jacket that cost more than my first month's rent in Atlanta, looking at me with the expression of someone who had made a decision in the night and come to act on it before he could talk himself out of fairness. I think we should talk, he said. I looked at him for a moment, took a breath. Then I stepped back and opened the door wide. He didn't sit down right away. He stood in the middle of my living room and looked around the way someone does when they are trying very hard to form a fair opinion and finding it slower going than they expected. He looked at the architectural plans spread across the dining table. He looked at the bookshelf I still hadn't gotten level. He looked at the worn chair by the window, the one with the cushion that had seen too many late nights, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression, like a man who had walked in expecting one kind of room and found another. I let him look. I did not offer coffee right away. I did not move to fill the silence with nervous words. Finally he turned. "You know who I am," he said. "Yes, sir." "Then you understand why I'm here." "I have a guess," I said, "but I'd rather hear it from you." He studied me. I could see Nora in him clearly in that moment. Not the warmth, not yet, but the stillness. The ability to hold a room without filling it with noise. "My daughter has been making certain things very clear to me recently," he said. "About her choices. About where her attention has gone." He paused. "I want to know what your intentions are toward her." "To be honest with her," I said. "To be someone she can rely on when things are hard. To build something real if she'll let me." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a simple answer." "It's a simple question," I said. "Once you get past all the complications around it." He crossed the room and sat down in the worn chair by the window. He lowered himself into it like a man carrying more than his posture was letting on, and he sat there with his hands resting on his knees, looking at the window instead of at me. "I have spent 30 years thinking very carefully about her future," he said slowly. "Every introduction, every opportunity, every door I kept open and every one I quietly closed." He stopped. "Griffin Hale is a good man. Steady. No. The kind of man whose next 10 years you can predict with reasonable confidence." "I know," I said. "No edge. No resentment. Just the plain truth of it." "You're not what I would have chosen for her," he said. "No," I agreed. "But I'm what she chose. And she didn't choose blindly. She took her time. She was careful. You raise someone who thinks before she moves. And when she finally moved, she moved toward me." Something traveled across his face. Not agreement. Not yet. But the particular expression of a man whose argument is still intact but whose certainty has developed a hairline crack. We talked for another 20 minutes. He asked about my work, my practice, how long I had been in Savannah, and what I intended to build here. He asked careful questions and listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone conducting an evaluation they had not yet decided how to score. I answered everything directly. I did not try to impress him. I just answered. When he finally stood to leave, he looked around the room one more time. Then he looked at me. "I appreciate that you spoke plainly," he said. "I find it saves time," I said. The corner of his mouth moved. Almost nothing, but something. He walked out. I watched his car pull slowly away from Kellerman Street, and I stood at the window for a long moment after it was gone, feeling the particular quiet that comes after a significant thing has happened but not yet resolved. That evening, my phone rang. "Nora." "He came to see you," she said. Not a question. "This morning." "Yes." "What did he say?" "That I wasn't what he planned for you," I said. "And I told him that was true, but that you were what mattered, not the plan." The line went quiet for a moment. "He came here after," she said. "He didn't stay long. He said he needed time, that he wasn't prepared to pretend he had no concerns." A pause. "But that he could see I had made up my mind." "Have you?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Completely," she said. "A long time ago, honestly." I leaned against the window frame and looked out at the street. Her porch light was on. Mine was on. 2 lit squares in the dark, side by side, the way they had been most nights since I moved in. "Good," I said. The months that followed were not easy. Robert Calloway kept his distance in the way powerful people do when they are regrouping. Not hostility exactly, more like a weather system that had moved off the coast and was deciding whether to return. He did not interfere. He did not encourage. He simply waited, and his waiting had a weight to it that Nora felt even when he wasn't in the room. But Nora did not shrink. She went to work. She delivered babies and steadied frightened patients and made the hard calls that most people could not make. And she came home tired and real and increasingly, undeniably herself. My firm picked up 2 new commissions in the same week. I hired Felix full-time. The office on Bull Street stopped feeling temporary and started feeling like mine. Nora came by the office late one afternoon, still in her scrubs, hair escaping whatever she had pinned it into that morning. She walked every room slowly, attentively, like she was listening to the space as much as looking at it. She stood in the main room for a long moment with the late light falling through the tall windows and said, "It feels like somewhere good things will happen." I watched her standing there in that light and thought, yeah, it does. Winter came gently to Savannah. The air cooled just enough to make evenings feel worth savoring. We had been together long enough now that the rhythm of it had settled into something ordinary and good, the better kind of ordinary, the kind you build on purpose. She cooked on nights she got home before 8. I handled every broken and malfunctioning thing in both houses. We walked the riverfront on Sunday mornings. We stayed up past midnight talking. And somewhere in all of that quiet daily choosing, we stopped being careful with each other and started being real. There was an evening in late October, the air just beginning to carry a hint of something cooler, the magnolia in her front yard gone darker and slower in the dusk, when she stayed at my house long after dinner was finished and the dishes were clean, and we sat together in the easy silence of two people who no longer needed conversation to fill every moment. The lamp threw a warm circle across the room. Outside, Kellerman Street was quiet. I will not dress that evening in more words than it needs. What I will say is that there are moments in a life that arrive not with fanfare but with the particular feeling of having finally arrived somewhere you did not know you were heading. That was one of them. We woke up the next morning in the same house. She made coffee, real coffee, the good kind, and stood at the kitchen window in the early light while the street was still asleep, and I watched her from the table and thought that this was the version of my life I had moved to Savannah to find, even if I hadn't known to describe it that way when I packed those 2 suitcases in Atlanta. In late November, on a quiet Tuesday evening, Nora came home and sat across from me at the kitchen table with an expression I had not seen before. Not worried, not sad, something more layered than either, the face of someone carrying news that is large and real and impossible to approach with small words. She told me she was pregnant. Just like that. No lead-up. No softening. Just the fact, placed on the table between us like something she had been holding carefully for days and was finally ready to set down. I looked at her. She looked at me. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a car moved slowly down the street. "Okay," I said. She blinked. "Okay." "Yeah," I said. "Okay. We figure it out. Together." She exhaled long, slow, the kind of breath that has been trapped inside a person for days. Her shoulders dropped. Her hands, which had been flat on the table, curled slightly inward. "I didn't know how you'd take it," she said, her voice smaller than usual. I kept running through every version of this conversation in my head and I couldn't. "Nora." I reached across the table. Waited. She put her hand in mine. "I'm not going anywhere. I thought I'd made that obvious by now." She laughed. A short, startled sound that was also almost crying. She pressed her free hand over her eyes and sat like that for a moment, laughing and overwhelmed and relieved all at once. I held her hand and said nothing more because nothing more was needed. Robert Calloway found out on a Sunday. Nora told him over a quiet lunch at her parents' house. Just the 3 of them. She walked me through it afterward, sitting cross-legged on my couch with a mug of tea, her voice steady and her eyes clear. Robert had said very little at first. 2 days later, he called me directly. "Not Nora. Me." He asked, without explanation or apology, if I would come to dinner that Friday evening. Just the 4 of us. I said yes. That dinner was the quietest significant thing I had ever sat through. Margaret Calloway, Nora's mother, whom I had only met briefly before, turned out to be nothing like her formal public presence suggested. She was sharp and warm and genuinely curious. She asked about my work with real interest and at one point mentioned a building near the waterfront that she had always found beautiful without ever knowing who had designed it. It was an early project from my time at the Atlanta firm, something I had contributed to before I had enough experience to have my name anywhere prominent on the drawings. When I told her, her face opened up in a way that had not been there before. Robert noticed. He said nothing, but I saw it register. By the end of the evening, nothing had been declared. No formal acceptance. No speech. But when Robert walked me to the door, He stopped with one hand on the frame and looked at me for a moment with an expression that had more in it than his words. "She's strong," he said quietly. "My daughter. She came by that honestly." A pause. "So did her instincts." It was not a warm embrace. It was not the movie version of a father's blessing. But it was real, and it was his, and from Robert Calloway that evening it was everything. We married on a Saturday in May. A small garden venue outside the city. Old stone walls, wisteria curling up the iron gates, uneven flagstone paths that guests navigated carefully in good shoes. Walter came, beaming and unhurried, in a shirt that suggested he had put in real effort. Felix and his wife sat near the back and clapped too loud at the right moments. A few of Nora's colleagues filled a row near the middle, the kind of people who knew her at her best and most demanding and showed up anyway. Margaret Calloway cried before the ceremony started. She tried to hide it behind her program. Robert stood beside her with his arm around her shoulders and kept it there through the whole thing. Nora came through the garden in a simple ivory dress, dark hair pinned up with a few soft pieces loose at her temples, and she walked toward me with the particular calm of a woman who has made her decision and is no longer carrying the weight of getting there. Just arriving. Just present. I had written something to say. I forgot it completely when she reached me. What came out instead was this. I almost didn't open the door that night. It was late. I was tired. And I had no idea that the person standing on my porch with a flashlight and an apology was about to become the most important thing I would ever build toward. She looked at me the way she had looked at me on the kitchen floor, on the porch steps, across the table in the dark. The same look each time, a little more unguarded, a little more fully hers. "You fixed my sink in 4 minutes," she said, "and stayed for an hour." I had absolutely no idea what I was walking into. The officiant finished. We signed what needed signing. Someone opened a bottle, and a small sound of joy went up from the people who had come to witness it. And on Kellerman Street, where 2 tired people had moved in next door to each other without any plan worth naming, a life that had once looked like scattered blueprints on a table, uncertain, unfinished, full of rooms that still needed work, had found its way, slowly and stubbornly and without anyone's permission, to something whole.